Alright, once we learn how to factor out the GCF, remember that you have to do that every single problem. Now, there may not be a GCF, and that's okay, but you always have to ask yourself, is there a GCF to pull out first? Don't skip that step, or you will make a mistake. So now, once we have pulled out the GCF, now we need to look and see how many terms that we have in our polynomial. This polynomial has 4 terms. When we see 4 terms, we factor by grouping. This is our technique that we do. Okay, so, and let me start back from the beginning with this problem. We have this polynomial, and our first rule says we have to pick out or pull out the GCF. So, do we have something in common in all 4 of these terms? And the answer would be no. We have some things in common in, some of them, but not in all 4. So now we look to see how many terms we have. Since there are 4 terms, we have to factor this by grouping. And in order to factor this by grouping, what we do is we kind of separate the problem, the first 2 terms and then the last 2 terms. And then we look at them individually. In these first 2 terms, we do have a common factor. That common factor would be a 5. So if I reverse distribute, or I factor out the 5 times what would give us 5x? And that would be an x. And then 5 times what would give us 5y? And that would be a positive y. Now we look at the second 2 terms. And we try and decide what do they have in common. And in this case, that would be an a. So if I pull an a out of here, then a times what gives me ax? That would be x. And a times what gives me ay? Ay. That would be a positive y. Now this has to be a positive a because positive a times x is positive ax, and positive a times positive y is positive ay. Now once we have factored out each individual set there, now we can look at this and go, hey, we still have something in common here. We have a common x plus y in both of those. So let's now factor out the x plus y. When we pull the x plus y out of the first term, we're left with 5. And when we pull it out of the last term, then we're left with a positive a. This is factoring by grouping. Now, I'm not going to do this problem here. I'm going to do that in the next video. I'm actually going to skip down to this problem here. So, first thing we need to do is look for a greatest common factor. And we look at all of those terms, and we don't see anything in common in all 4 of them. So now, because there are 4 terms, this is a factor by grouping technique. So we're going to separate our problem and look at the first 2 terms. In these first 2 terms, we have a 5 in common, and we also have an x in common. So when I pull the 5x out, then 5x times what will give us 15x squared, and that would be a 3x. And 5x times what would give us negative 5xy, and that would be a negative y. Now we look at the next 2 terms. They both have a 6 and a y in common. So I'm going to pull out the 6y. 6y times what would give me back this problem? That would be 3x. And 6y times what would give me negative 6y squared? That would be a negative y. Now we had to pull out a positive 6y in order to make that happen. So when I look at it now, I see that we have a common 3x minus y that we could now factor. So when we pull that out of the first term, we're left with 5x. And when we factor that out of the second term, we're left with a positive 6y. So that is the factorization of this polynomial.